this is Karama's Girl 018, and this is part 2 of my reading of the Stolen Throne, Chapter 5. The enemy was on their third charge up the path. Logain was soaked in sweat and blood both, a burning fiery pain in his chest from where a blade had successfully stabbed earlier. He ignored it and fought on. 7 were left of the 30 knights that had ridden up the path with him, and they stood their ground at the top of the bluff as wave after wave of the enemy soldiers tried to break through. These were Ferelden soldiers they were fighting, urged on by our legion commanders who remained safely below, sending their dogs to do their dirty work, he thought angrily. The enemy had brought halberds this time, wicked axe blades attached to long poles that gave them the advantage of reach. He had lost almost 10 men immediately to the first rush of the halberdiers as they reached the top of the path and had nearly overtaken them. One man lost his arm as it was hacked off, blood spurting as the man stared at it aghast. "Push them back!" Logain shouted. An enemy soldier leaped on him, half to attack and half because he had been shoved forward from behind. Startled, Logain was pushed back for a moment. The soldier, a short man with a weasel-like face, looked excited at the thought he might have struck a blow at the mighty prince and moved to strike again. Logain grabbed the man by the throat and threw him back. The short soldier stumbled, and his flailing hands caught onto the royal purple cloak, which by now had been stained a sticky black by blood and filth. He fell to the side, tugging hard on the cloak, and Logain slashed with his sword to cut the fabric. Released, the soldier stumbled back even further and went careening over the cliff edge, screaming shrilly. Another man was on top of Logain before he could recover, a large man with a robust beard, and then a second charged him, axe held high overhead. Logain ducked down low and spun around, swinging a wide arc with his sword. It took the axe wielder across the abdomen, slicing him open. As the man stumbled, Logain struck out with his elbow and took the red-headed, bearded soldier in the throat. It didn't stop him from stabbing Logain in the shoulder, but Logain merely hissed in pain and jumped back, forcing the blade to be pulled out of him. He struck out with his sword again, and the red-bearded man barely parried as he gasped and coughed. They traded several blows, Logain gaining greater strength and position with each one until finally he ran the man through. The few knights with him were barely holding on, and yet still the enemy pressed forward. Logain almost couldn't see with the sweat stinging his eyes, and the gore covering the ground at the lip of the path made getting one's footing on the rocks difficult. Oh God, there's a curse word. Where's the darned reinforcement? He thought, striking out at new enemies as they pressed forward. Even as they asked the question, he knew the answer. They weren't coming. It didn't make sense for them to come. In fact, if he was in the Jarl's shoes right now, he wouldn't come either. He grunted angrily and slashed even harder, trying to keep the enemy from getting past their line. Another man rushed him, and he got his boot up onto the man's midsection and then kicked out, sending the man flying back and over the cliff's edge with a horrified cry. And then a horn sounded. Logain wiped his eyes and looked down at the cliff and began laughing out loud in sheer surprise. The thundering of hoofs heralded the charge of the rest of the rebel forces of horsemen as they struck the larger enemy force from behind. The armored figure leading the charge could only be Rowan, the green plume atop her head trailing. The effect on the enemy was dramatic. The Orlesians were pushed back towards the cliff, their shouts turning to confusion and surprise. Almost immediately their organization broke. Panic overtook the foot soldiers, and they began to scramble and run, even as the commander screamed ineffectively for them to hold. Logain had no more time to watch as the enemies still on the path became desperate, caught between the crush of men trying to run up behind them to escape the cavalry charge, and Logain's remaining men, and their fearful cries became deafening. "Now! Do it! Push them back!" he shouted. 6 knights stood next to him, their armor smeared with gore and all of them heavily wounded, but they gritted their teeth and did as he commanded. They pressed their advantage and began swinging hard to drive the enemy back. There was a long moment of frenzied resistance as steel met steel, and then the enemy line broke. With a victorious shout, Logain moved forward and stabbed his blade into 2 men who scrambled backwards while screaming for mercy. The knights beside him did the same, and as the enemy fell back, they ran out of ground and forced a whole group of their own soldiers off the cliff. There was mass panic below. The enemy was racing to get out of the way of the horsemen, dashing into the forest at the edges of the valley. Some even dropped their weapons in the rush. One of the Orlesian commanders screamed at his men with indignation, attempting to lead a rally, but Rowan put a quick end to that. A pair of hoofs caught the pompous fellow off in mid-shout, sending his body flying against the rocks and galvanizing the nearest enemy soldiers into even quicker retreat. Calling to several of her men to follow her, Rowan turned and raced up the path toward Logain. Encouraged by the sight, Logain urged his knights to continue pushing, and they did. They were shoving forward now, sweeping the line of enemy soldiers before them off the edge of the path like so much debris off the front step. The blood-curdling screams as those men were sent falling to their deaths were difficult to bear. And then they stood at the edge, Logain and his 6 men. They stared down at the carnage below, the many men lying broken at the bottom of a 100-foot drop. Like dolls scattered by an angry child, Logain thought grimly. The few soldiers left on the path were now leaping off the side to get out of the way of Rowan and the several horsemen charging with her up the path. Those who stood their ground were cut down mercilessly. One of them was a lone, quaking halberdier who leveled his weapon towards the horse racing at him. Rowan pulled her horse to one side at the last moment and efficiently sliced her blade deep into the man's neck as she rode past. He went down without so much as a blink. When Rowan reached the top of the path, she slid off her horse in one smooth motion and ran toward Logain, lifting up her helmet. Brown hair spilled around her face as she took in the sight of the small number of wounded, haggard men standing there with him. They all stared back at her dumbly, numb with exhaustion and the fading remnants of adrenaline. "Are you all right?" she asked uncertainly, her expression concerned. Logain walked toward her and held out his hand. Rowan hesitated, staring at him as if she wasn't sure what it meant before she relaxed and shook it. "That was quite the charge," he congratulated her. Their eyes met, lingering a moment longer than was necessary. Rowan quickly disengaged her hand and glanced away. "I can't believe you lasted this long. I wish I'd come sooner." She nodded officiously to the other men behind Logain, several of whom had dropped to their knees. "Well done, all of you." "It's not over yet," he sighed. Already he could see the enemy recovering below. The charge had spooked them and taken a toll on their forces, but it wouldn't be long before the Orlesians would recover from the shock. They still had the superior numbers, after all, and if they realized it quick enough, they could race back into the clearing and surround Rowan's men. They needed to get out. Now. Rowan was nodding, and understanding the situation exactly as he did, he realized. Logain found himself hardly surprised. "Merrick will need us. Let's go while we still can." Merrick panted at the edge of the battle. During a few rare seconds he could even breathe in the chaos, ears ringing with the sound of steel on steel. His sword arm ached so badly he thought it might just fall off. He also suddenly noticed an arrow sticking out of his shoulder, the shaft having penetrated between the grooves of his fine armor. "Well, that would explain the jabbing pain I felt earlier," he thought to himself. The ebb and flow of the melee seemed to go on forever. He lost the ability to judge what was actually going on with the overall battle once Arl Rendon had charged the line. It had become his only concern just to survive, facing an endless array of opponents that charged at him from every direction. So far, he remained alive despite it all. The heavy dwarven armor he wore had repelled dozens of strikes, without so much as a dent. Far too many rebels had been killed before Merrick's eyes, trying to buy their prince a few more moments of life. Even with all this protection, his sword dripped with the blood of men who would surely have killed him if Merrick hadn't been a second faster than they. And then, of course, there was the blind luck. At one point he had been barreled over by a giant of a man in chain armor, and when Merrick had rolled over he had seen a great axe ready to come down right on top of his head. None of his protectors had been near enough to help. All that had saved him was an errant gauntlet flung from some unknown soldier nearby, probably by accident, which struck the giant in the back of the head and knocked him off balance. The axe came down just shy of Merrick's ear. His breath had steamed on the metal of the axe head buried in the ground, not an inch away from the tip of his nose. The giant soldier yanked the axe back up, but this time Wilhelm had intervened. An arc of lightning streaked across the battlefield and led the gaping, smoking hole in the fellow's chest. Merrick had at least enough sense to roll out of the way before the man toppled over like a falling building. Evidently, Merrick's time on Thetis was not quite up yet. He gritted his teeth against the pain in his shoulder and cast an eye over the battlefield. The first thing he wondered was what had happened to Rowan. He couldn't see the gleam of her helmet, either racing across the field or lying on it. Nor were there any horsemen in the battle. How long had they been fighting? Was the bulk of the enemy force about to fall on them from the south? He found himself worrying about Logain most of all, and the possibility that he might have asked the man to commit himself as to a useless sacrifice. If Gareth's son died trying to keep him alive as well. And then the horn sounded. Relatedly, to be sure, but it still had the desired effect. In the distance he could see Rowan's horsemen charging into the enemy lines, scattering them in every direction. It proved to be enough. Over the next 10 minutes, desperation surged among the soldiers on both sides. Merrick could hear the Earl shouting to the men, urging them to press toward the hill, and Merrick began to do the same. Blood was spilling rapidly as casualties mounted, but as the horsemen took their toll, the enemy began to pull back. The enemy commanders ordered a retreat, shouting for their men to regroup outside the valley. Merrick was almost tempted to give chase as he watched the enemy soldiers scrambling to get away, but Arwendon's arrival prevented them. prevented him. "Let them go! We must make a run for it!" he shouted. The man was clutching his chest and bleeding heavily as he was supported by 2 others. Seeing this, Merrick merely nodded and began calling for the men to fall back. It was not a victory. In the end, after hours of confusion and running as the rebel army retreated out of the valley, they managed to regroup at the edge of a small river nearby several miles to the north. The men arrived in dribs and drabs, exhausted and wounded, and sometimes carrying each other. Men on horses were sent out to look for others who had fled in different directions. But in the end, it looked as if they had lost at least half their numbers. On top of this, much of their supplies and equipment had been left in the valley out of necessity. But it felt like a victory to Merrick. Instead of losing everything that his mother had built, they had survived. They had evaded the usurper's trap, and he even dealt them a bloody nose on the way out. As sore as their condition was, the usurper's forces would not be so quick to be on the trail. Not tonight, and that was all the rebels needed. When Rowan finally brought a bruised and bloody Logain to the fire at their new tent, still wearing fancy leathers and the soiled, tattered remains of the queen's purple cloak, Merrick cried out in glee and ran forward to sweep up the startled Logain in a great bear hug. I can imagine that. Logain winced in pain but tolerated the display, staring down at Merrick as if he'd gone mad. "It worked!" Merrick cried. "Your plan bloody well worked!" "Enough!" Logain gripped, shoving Merrick away so that he was quickly dropped. "Have a care, Merrick." Rowan chided him with amusement. "Logain's taken several wounds to his chest." "Bah! He's invulnerable!" Merrick laughed, and then danced away exuberantly. He circled the fire like some kind of barbarian shaman performing a strange victory ritual while the while laughing maniacally. Logain watched him mystified and then looked incredulously towards Rowan. "He does this often?" "I'm thinking he may have taken a blow to the head." All Rendorn walked up to them then, now out of his armor and sporting thick bandages across his midsection, the cloth already darkening with bloodstains. One of his eyes was likewise bandaged, and he limped heavily. His expression was angry enough to draw notice, and when Rowan went to offer him support, he waved her off with a glower. "Apparently," he stated with meter rage, "you have decided that my orders do not need to be followed." Merrick detected the tension and stopped his wild careening, turning to address the Earl. "Your Grace, is something amiss?" "Plenty, as she well knows." Rowan nodded soberly, accepting the recrimination. "I know you're angry, Father." She held up a hand to stave off any further outbursts from him. "But I did what needed to be done. Had I not routed them, at least for a time, they might have marched north once Logain was slain. She also killed one of the Orlesian commanders," Logain pointed out, "quite spectacularly." "We might have been away by then," the Earl snapped, and then he looked at Logain and softened somewhat. "But it is good that you live, lad, and your plan did succeed." From Logain he turned toward Merrick, frowning. "I would be happier, however, if our condition was not so poor. We have lost a great number of men and much equipment. Moving forward will be difficult." Merrick walked over to Rendorn and put a comforting hand on the Earl's shoulder, grin remaining even if his enthusiasm was diminished. "I agree, but still, I think there is much to celebrate. The rebellion drew blood and lives on." All Rendorn attempted a wan smile. "Your mother," he began, voice thick with emotion, "would have been very proud to see you today, my boy." Merrick was startled at both the display of emotion and the tears he fought in his own eyes as he and Earl Rendorn hugged roughly. Backs were clapped fondly, and then when Merrick stepped away, he could only nod awkwardly to the Earl in the silence. Merrick turned to Logain, who had taken a seat by the fire. He held out a hand, and Logain slowly shook it. "Thank you for everything you did today, Logain. I do hope you'll consider staying with us." "You should have seen him up on that bluff," Rowan said. "He was magnificent. The knights that fought with him are already talking about it." Logain smiled a bit shyly. Merrick wondered if it was in fact the first time he'd actually seen the man smile. "It was a difficult situation, and we did what we had to." He then looked up at Merrick almost apologetically, holding up what remains of the purple cloak. "I also ruined your mother's cloak." Merrick laughed, and Rowan joined in. "You're being modest," she teased. Indeed, the Earl limped up to Logain and shook his hand as well. "I misjudged you. You clearly have excellent instincts, and we could use your assistance." Logain's blue eyes shifted among the Earl and Merrick and Rowan, and for a moment Merrick thought he looked almost trapped. He glanced down at the fire and stared at it for a time before reluctantly nodding. Very well, I'll stay. For now." Pleased, Merrick turned at last to Rowan. Even bruised and battered, she looked radiant. It was just her way. She brightened as he took her hands in his. "When you hadn't charged, I thought perhaps we'd lost you," he said seriously. "Don't scare me like that again." Her eyes teared, although she grinned and laughed. You don't get out of it that easy, Merrick. Funny, he answered dryly. Logan looked up from the fire, nonplussed. Get out of what? He asked the Jarl. Merrick and Rowan are betrothed, Arvindern smiled. She was promised to him when she was born. Ah, Logan said simply, and returned his gaze to the fire. Not much later, Merrick slipped away from the fire and walked alone under the night sky. The moon shone down, and glowing moths fluttered in great swarm nearby. It was strangely peaceful, he thought. The campfires that dotted the riverbank were far too few, and the faint groans of wounded men were the only sounds that punctuated the silence. He walked nearer to one of the fires, wincing as he saw the huddle of bandaged and exhausted soldiers around it. Some tents had been hastily erected, but there were a great number of soldiers who were sleeping on the ground, some without even blankets. The men around the fire stared into it blankly, trying very hard not to hear the anguished cries of those who would not survive the night coming from further upriver. Merrick watched, hovering just out of sight, and yet feeling strangely drawn. He tried to tell himself they might all be dead now had he not insisted on the battle. Your Highness? He heard from nearby. Merrick startled and turned toward the sound. A soldier was there in the shadows, lying against a tree. As Merrick approached, he noticed that the man was older, probably too old to still be fighting. Then he saw that the man's right leg stopped at the knee, a mass of bloody bandages showing a recent amputation. The fellow was pale and shaking, drinking liberally from a wineskin. I'm so sorry about your leg, Merrick offered, feeling inadequate. The man grinned, glancing at his new step and patting it almost affectionately. It doesn't hurt so much now, he chuckled. The mage even said he might come by and do what he could. Merrick didn't know what to say. He stood there a moment until the man offered up his wineskin as a toast. I saw you on the field today, Your Highness. Fought not 20 feet from you at one point. You did? I'm going to tell my grandchildren one day I fought beside the prince, he said proudly. You were quite the sight, my lord. I watched you take down 3 men in a row like it was nothing. I'm sure you were distracted, Merrick grinned. I was scared. I knew we were going to win, the soldier insisted. He looked at Merrick with shining eyes. When you came back to us this morning, we all knew it. The Maker sent you to us, to protect you. Maybe he did. The Merrick grinned up at him and drank deeply from the wineskin. To the Queen, he toasted drunkenly to the moon. You rest in peace now, Your Majesty. You did your part. Merrick felt tears well up in his eyes, but ignored them. Quietly he took the skin and drank deeply from it. To the Queen, he toasted to the moon. And suddenly, it all didn't seem quite as daunting as before. And that is the end of Chapter 5, you guys. Stay tuned for Chapter 6.